reminded that Filipino Workers Network, we join in making a better Canada. A Canada that cares about its people, a Canada that protects the rights of workers, and uphold the rights and freedom of its people. We demand respect, justice, and dignity. We demand employment standard, a living wage, and good job. We oppose the privatization of public utilities like Toronto Hydro or Toronto Community Housing. We recognize the climate change, that it is real. We condemn racism and racial discrimination. And finally, we demand better rights for temporary foreign workers and migrant workers. We strongly support the demand for permanent resident status for all temporary workers currently working in Canada. We are committed to uphold respect, dignity, and better living and working conditions for all migrant workers. Today, we are here to move forward and unite the Filipino workers, to fight for a good job, fairness, and justice. We must rise together as Filipino and as workers to make our world a better place, our Toronto a better place, and we should start now. Our topics today will help us learn and understand. Hopefully, we commit ourselves to our collective struggle to advance and improve workers' lives and their families' lives and make Canada a better place. And we should protect it. We had it, and we should all keep on protecting it and keep on improving it. I think that's the message that we have. We all came here as immigrants, and we came here to get a better future for our family, our kid. So we should all protect it and try to improve it. As Filipino, as one of the big group here, we should all stand out and be proud that we're Filipino and we're here, we're working class people, and we struggle a bit, but at the end of the day, we're here united with all the people here who came here in Canada, same as us. So today, we should all welcome the next speaker. We are privileged to have him here, the President of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, Mr. John Cartwright. Labour Council represents 205,000 union members from over 150 locals in Canada's largest urban center. John is a carpenter by trade. He was formerly the business manager of the Construction Trade Council and served on the board of the United Way Toronto York Region Field as well as the Labor Education Center. Since becoming Labor Council President, Jen has worked with affiliated unions to craft an aggressive equity agenda for Toronto's labor movement. John is a co-chair of the Toronto Community Benefit Network, which works to provide career opportunities for racialized communities on major infrastructure projects. With John's leadership, the various diverse workers network were organized, including the Filipino Workers Network. Please welcome Mr. John Cartwright.
Well, good morning, sisters and brothers. Originally I was just going to talk for 2 minutes, but now that Louisa Blue is being delayed on her plane, I've got to talk for about 45 minutes. No, seriously, I am going to take some time because our agendas had to be adjusted a little bit to talk about the journey that working people have been on in this city. You know, Toronto, since the First Nations, Indigenous people gave us the name Toronto. Anybody know what that name means? A gathering place in Ojibwe. Ever since that name was bestowed on this area, this has been a city and region that's been built by generation after generation of immigrants and refugees and their descendants. My parents came here from somewhere else looking for a better life. They came after the Second World War, from the coal mining towns and the mill towns in the north of England. But I think almost every one of us in this room, our families or ourselves, have come from somewhere else looking to make a better life. In 1871, what's the math there, 147 years ago, a small group of people, 8 or 10 men from the original unions, the carpenters, the printers, the people who make barrels, the iron molders, and the bricklayers, came together and said, we need something better than the collective agreement we can bargain. These were the first days of unions in Canada. We need something better than just setting the hours of work and the wages at my employer. We need to have a bigger vision. A vision of a labor family that can bargain for a better world. And we often say that as trade unions, we do two kinds of bargaining. Our own union bargains wages and conditions at work. But as a family of unions, through the Labour Council, which represents now over 208,000 people in this city, we do something called political bargaining. We go to the powers that be at the top, whether they're in the federal government or provincial government or the city or our school boards or sometimes the heads of companies and sectors. And we say, we want a different deal. We want something that's going to work for ourselves, our communities, and our families. And we've done that political bargaining for years and years and years. Now, the first unions that were formed here were in the trades. They were occupations. And not long after that group of men got together, they were joined by women who were in the garment industry and bootmakers, and later on retail sector. In the 1930s, mass industries were organized through the CIO unions. So the steel workers and the auto industry and the electrical industry and rubber and chemical were all organized through mass organizing, and those were called industrial unions. And in the 1960s, workers who were involved in public sector and healthcare unions, which were often called associations at the time, they became organized to get strong trade union roles and trade union rights. And in these last 20 years, our movement has been joined by professionals. Nurses that are here today, teachers, professors, engineers, and others have decided that they also need to be part of a strong movement because the relationship they had long ago with their employers had been changed with austerity and neoliberalism. So together, coming from all those backgrounds, we have created a strong union family. I want to point out a couple of pieces in history as well. In 1947, union leaders who had seen the horrors of the Second World War, who had seen the horrors of the Holocaust, where millions of people were massacred because they were Jewish, but also saw the reality in this city that black workers couldn't get a job in many workplaces. They were relegated to working in the railway industry or in other service jobs. Those Jewish and black trade unionists came together and created something called the Toronto Joint Labour Committee on Human Rights. And they went with a conscious program to challenge discrimination and racism in workplaces, in hotels, in restaurants, in taverns, and in apartments. And they went out and did test cases, challenging employers who still said, it's my right, I run my business, and if I want to serve somebody or not serve somebody, that's my right as a business. And the Joint Committee on Labor Rights challenged those people. Some of you may have seen a TV show last year on CBC, a book called Book of Negroes. Anybody saw that show? About an incredible story of African Americans who ended up coming to Canada after the Civil War. The writer of that book, Lawrence Hill, is an award-winning Canadian author. The reason he's Canadian is because his parents, his mother, chose to come to Toronto to get a job with the Toronto Joint Labour Committee on Human Rights. His parents were mixed race, and when they went to get an apartment, time after time, they were told, oh, I'm sorry, the apartment's been rented out. And then our committee would send a white couple a few minutes later and say, of course, yes, the apartment is ready. We forced the first human rights legislation in this province. It didn't come by somebody being enlightened and saying, isn't it nice we should have human rights legislation? Workers in our unions forced the government of the day to bring in human rights legislation. Is that a good thing for us? And then in 1954, the Joint Labour Committee on Human Rights joined a delegation of 50 African Canadians, led by Donald Moore of the Negro Improvement Association, and Bromley Armstrong of the Auto Workers Union. They went to Ottawa demanding a change in the racist immigration policies that this country had upheld. They demanded that the doors of this country be open to all. They pointed out the disparity of why my father who fought in the Second World War for the British Army, was welcomed and subsidized in his country. And yet his comrades in arms, who were soldiers or sailors from the Caribbean, from South Asia, from Africa, had the door closed. And they said, that's not right for Canada. And eventually, they helped change the immigration laws in this country. They're still not perfect. But it was the labor movement working with workers of color who changed those laws and allowed this country to be welcoming so many of us here today. But the reality for immigrants and refugees was never easy. The first big wave of non-Anglo-Irish, Scottish immigrants to this country were from Italy. They were welcomed here because this city needed to build, and they needed construction workers. There was a huge garment industry, and they needed garment industry workers. The manufacturing was building, and they needed workers. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of Italians were welcomed here and treated like dirt. Every week, another Italian construction worker would be killed, and the attitude was, okay, take them away, bring on the next walk. Honestly, my sisters and brothers, that was the attitude in my industry. And in 1960, 5 young Italian-Canadian men were working in a tunnel project at Hogs Hollow at Yonge Street, just south of York Mills. The company was breaking every rule. No respect for health and safety in any kind. A fire broke out. The man on top didn't know what to do. He stopped the air pumps. And with the air pumps gone, the tunnel collapsed and those 5 young men were buried alive. And they died. Terrible death. But fortunately, there was a journalist that wanted to tell that story. And the front pages of the Toronto Star and the Toronto Telegram were covered every day with the tragedy. And the Italian community had said, this is enough. People killed every day. Now, 5 young men in the prime of their life taken away. And our women disrespected in the garment industry. And when we go and we're having a coffee on St. Clair or Danforth after the day, the police come and tell us to get off the sidewalk. And our kids in schools are treated like crap because how can you be intelligent? Your parents can't even speak English. That was the attitude of the day. Every young immigrant kid was streamed. And that community rose up. 17,000 Italian Canadians went to the CNE Stadium and demanded a different deal in this city and in this country. A different deal. And because of their anger and their efforts and their organizing, we got new health and safety laws, we got new labor laws, and yes, when they started to elect people to city council and the school board, we got programs in schools that respected our kids. We got programs in our city that respected that different cultures want to celebrate in different ways. Hogs Hollow was a fundamental time in the history of this city. It created a new deal between immigrants and the old elites. But the other important decision that was made by immigrants and immigrant families and their allies was to go into the schools and say, we want our kids to respect where they came from. And we fought and won for heritage language programs in our schools, and later Black and African heritage programs. So that kids could learn not only their mother tongue, but also to be proud of who they are and where they came from. When I was 18 years old, I married into an Italian family. I was crazy about that young Calabrese girl, so I took Catholic classes and got married and understood how the kids thought because their parents were old style, you know, they were a little embarrassed. They weren't really proud. But the struggle in our school system to have those courses so kids could learn their language, could learn about their heritage, change things. And when we say that this is a city where we come from 192 countries and speak 100 languages and will live in relative harmony, that's not an accident. That's not because some wise people said you should live in harmony. It's because we struggled and won programs that would allow people to feel respected, to ensure we have challenged discrimination and bigotry, and we struggle with each other. And having our kids learn about their own self-worth in school. If you're proud of yourself, you don't have to be a bully. You don't have to put anybody down. You can accept people and their differences. No matter what their heritage, their language, their religion, their sexual orientation, their color, you can accept people if you're proud in yourself, if you're confident in yourself. And that's a lesson that our labor movement has learned for so long. In the 1990s, when we elected an NDP government, they brought in an anti-racism secretariat to explicitly go forward and look at ongoing issues of lingering racism and discrimination. And our good comrade Jojo Geronimo, who later became the director of our Labor Education Center, a founding member of the Filipino Workers Network, the author of the Leader's Guide to Equity, was working with the Anti-Racism Secretariat. Employment equity became a reality in this province for a brief period of time before the Conservatives shut it down. And finally, some of the obstacles were being taken away from people of color and First Nations people being able to get good jobs and good careers. You're going to talk much more later over this day about your own journey as Filipinos, as Pinoys and Filipinos. But you know that the caregiver program is one of the first doors open to Filipinos coming here, and then the temporary workers programs. And our labor movement has partnered with the key activists in the community who've been fighting for those rights. Our Labor Education Center has partnered with a number of community groups to help put on courses so people can have the knowledge that they need to be able to actively be involved in our society. Another key point in our history that made a difference. About 10 years ago, Chinese Canadian members working for newspapers here, Singtao, which is owned by the Toronto Star, a Chinese daily paper, where they were getting half of the wages that the white workers were at the Toronto Star. Organized into a union, went on strike, got a first contract. Then they reached out to another and another. And in the newspaper Mingpao, which is another daily newspaper, the employer put out a front page editorial during the organizing drive saying, we don't need outside interference in our enterprise. And by outside, he was meaning not just a union, he was meaning what they say in Chinese Guido, white. We don't need white interference in our enterprise. And of course, the organizing committee were all Chinese. So they said, this is ridiculous. And they decided that they wanted to send a message back. So they helped to create the Chinese Workers Network, and they got a beautiful poster with pictures of about 20 different Chinese Canadian Union members from every walk of life: teachers, nurses, engineers, transit drivers, healthcare workers, municipal workers, electricians, hotel workers, saying we're proud to be union because unions in Canada are part of the mainstream. And that message has set the stage for the Chinese Workers Network, our first diverse workers network, to create a massive impression in the area, and for Chinese workers to feel they can step forward and say, yes, I want a union because I want justice in the workplace. We learned from that, and our Filipino sisters and brothers in our movement stepped forward and said, hey, what about us? Why don't we have a network? Will the Labor Council support the initiative of this of our Filipino workers to come together? And some are in the room here, people like Ben and Paulina Corpus and Michael Guzman and Alex Balang and others, so I'm sure I'm going to miss, sorry. Luisa from OPSU, Tony from USW, came forward and said, let's create a Filipino workers network. And this journey that you're on now is part of that effort that's supported by our Labor Council. As we've learned from that, we've created the Tamil Workers Network, Somali Workers Network, Ethiopian Eritrean Workers Network. To be able to say that in our movement, not every leader has to look like me. In our movement, we have to celebrate, not just celebrate diversity by saying, isn't multiculturalism nice, but empowering every one of us. Because the lessons we bring from our home countries, from our own personal journeys, are so crucial for the richness and the ability of this labor movement in this country and this city to build labor power, to win justice, economic justice, social justice, racial justice, and climate justice. Why do I say climate justice? We all know what's happened with the climate change, the extreme weather, the huge disasters that have affected back home in the Philippines, with the typhoons and others that have devastated. In South Asia with the massive climate change, the droughts in North Africa, that are devastating the lives of the people who are our members. And I often say, you know, as a negotiator, and I've negotiated with companies large and small, that I can negotiate 10 cents an hour, 20 cents an hour, and that's really good. But if our grandchildren can't breathe the air and drink the water, we've actually failed. And we have an obligation as a labor movement to step up and be involved in finding solutions to the serious challenge of climate change. You're going to hear a bit later on about Bill 148. Bill 148 is an amazing victory that we won on labor law and employment status. And Melissa Bayon is going to walk you through that. But you know, I'll tell you, I spend a lot of time with my friends in the States. And they say, you know, when we go to sleep and dream in Technicolor, the things we would hope for in labor law looks like what you already had in the Ontario Labor Relations Act. And now you've won so much more. Wow, you guys have to use those tools to reach out to hundreds of thousands of unrepresented workers and bring union to them and union voice and equality to them. And I'm so pleased that the Filipino Workers Network was part of making the presentation to the Changing Workplace Review to talk about the explicit things, especially around temp agencies, especially around equal pay for rights, especially around organizing rights, that found its way into the final legislation. I mentioned employment equity before, and in my introduction it talked about the Toronto Community Benefits Network. We recognize that in many good jobs and professions, there's still obstacles in front of people, newcomers, to come into those jobs. So our labor movement, along with communities, have created something called the Toronto Community Benefits Network. We went to Metrolinx that was going to build a $5 billion construction project on Eglinton Avenue, the big crosstown line. And we said, you know, there's going to be thousands of job opportunities there. We want to make sure those job opportunities are open to racialized communities, to women, because in construction it's only about 2 or 3% women, to First Nations, and to young people who maybe don't even realize that this is an opportunity to them. And we created a framework agreement called the Community Benefits Agreement, and it requires that 10% of all the hours on that jobs will be done by workers from diverse communities. 10%. That's employment. That's the first employment equity agreement negotiated in Ontario since 1995. And we didn't say stop at construction trades. We also said a lot of our people in our communities don't want to get their hands, they don't want to become a carpenter like me or an ironworker or an electrician. They've gone to university, they've gone to college, they've got a degree. What about them? And we looked all across North America at community benefits agreements. Nobody had ever bargained for the white-collar positions. And we said, guess what? We want to bargain that as well. So now, there is a jobs pipeline for internationally trained professionals or new college or university graduates from newcomer communities to be able to get those jobs in the design, the engineering, the technical, the accounting, the professional work in those jobs. And they asked us, what should be the target? I said, we actually don't know, because it's never been done before anywhere in North America, anywhere in the world. So we said, you know we're going to get 300 or 400 apprentices. If we got 50 jobs in the white collar, that would be good. And my sisters and brothers, I'm glad to say that a year ago we got more than 50. And as of January, we had 110 people from newcomer communities getting those good skilled jobs. That's what political bargaining is. Our victory in the Canada Pension Plan that we just won is political bargaining. Most of us have workplace pensions. We said we don't want that just for ourselves, we want that for all Canadians. And the union movement and communities came together and we just got a massive expansion of Canadian Pension Plan. We're arguing for pharmacare. You're going to hear that later. That's political bargaining. So the workers that started our Labour Council 147 years ago, you know, if you think about generation, that's about 7 generations back. And the people whose the original livers in this, the people who originally lived in this world, in this town, in this land, the First Nations people have an expression. They say, when you make a decision today, you should understand how that decision will affect 7 generations from now. Don't make it just about today or tomorrow. What wisdom do you need to bring to your decision that it will impact 7 generations from now? I think that those people 7 generations ago that decided to create a labor movement, a family of unions, building solidarity together, to negotiate not just for our wages and hours in our workplace, but to negotiate for a better Canada. They made an incredibly important decision. And I think they leave us with a challenge. Will we also step up, build this network, build this labor movement, so that 7 generations from now, our descendants can say, yes, they made the right decision, they built a movement, they built a better Canada. My sisters and brothers, that's our challenge, and that's our hope, and those are our dreams. Thank you very much.